The letter that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a seed catalog and a notice from the bank, and it smelled faintly of rose water that did not belong to the woman who had written it. Clara Whitmore pressed her back against the rough-hewn wall of the post office in Redemption Creek, Kansas, the year 1882, pressing down on her like a summer sky gone heavy with storm clouds. She held the envelope in both hands and read her sister's name written in a stranger's careful script. Miss Vivienne Whitmore. The handwriting was deliberate, patient, the kind of penmanship a man practiced on Sunday evenings when he had nothing else to do but think about the woman he was hoping to meet. Vivienne was dead. She had been dead for 6 weeks, taken by a fever that swept through the boarding house where they had both lived since their father passed. 6 weeks of grief so sharp it had edges, and now here was this letter, this beautiful, impossible letter, addressed to a woman who no longer existed. Clara opened it. She told herself she opened it because she was the only family Vivienne had left, because someone had to deal with the practicalities of a dead woman's correspondence, because it was the responsible thing to do. She opened it because she was 22 years old and exhausted and frightened of what the next month would bring when Mrs. Gable at the boarding house started asking for rent she did not have. The letter was from a man named Eli Calloway. He wrote from a ranch outside a town called Cedar Hollow in the Colorado Territory, a place Clara had only ever seen printed on a map in the schoolroom where she had briefly taught. He had corresponded with Vivienne through a matrimonial bureau in St. Louis, the kind of arrangement that was common enough in those days when women in the East needed stability and men in the West needed a partner to share the silence of the frontier. Vivienne had signed on 3 months ago, when things had seemed less desperate, when she had still been alive and full of plans. Eli Calloway wrote well. That was the first thing Clara noticed. He did not write like a man, simply checking off items on a practical list. He wrote about the way the light fell over the mountains in the morning, about the sound the creek made after a rain, about how the ranch felt too quiet some evenings, and how he was ready to fill that quiet with something real. He wrote about wanting a partner, not just a homemaker, someone who would argue with him when he was wrong and laugh with him when the work was done. He asked Vivienne about her favorite season, about whether she could ride a horse, about what she believed in. Clara read it 3 times standing in the post office doorway while old Mr. Finch swept around her feet and said nothing. She took the letter home. She sat at the small table by the window and she thought about Vivienne, about her sister's quick laughter and the way she had always been the braver one, the bolder one, the one who signed her name to a matrimonial bureau without telling anyone until it was already done. She thought about Mrs. Gable's rent. She thought about the schoolroom that had closed when the town's fortunes shifted. She thought about herself at 22 with $31 in a tin box under her bed and no prospects that she could name. She took out paper and she wrote back. She did not plan it the way it might sound in the telling. She did not sit down with a scheme fully formed. She simply began to answer his questions because they were beautiful questions and she had honest answers to them. And somewhere in the middle of writing about how she believed that autumn was the most truthful season because it did not pretend that things did not end, she understood what she was doing. She was writing as Vivienne. She had signed Vivienne's name to the matrimonial bureau's original letter because she had found Vivienne's draft of that first letter tucked in her Bible, and she had simply continued the correspondence that her sister had begun. It was wrong. She knew it was wrong before the ink dried, but she sealed the letter and sent it. That was in October. By November, they were writing twice a week. By December, something had shifted in the letters that Clara could not name and did not try to. Eli Calloway wrote about his day in a way that suggested he was writing to someone he trusted. He mentioned a horse named Copper that he was trying to gentle, and a neighbor named Roy Benson who drank too much and borrowed tools he never returned. He wrote about his mother, who had died when he was 14, and how the ranch had originally been her dream before it became his. There was a tenderness in his writing that Clara found herself anticipating all week, waiting for the Tuesday and Friday deliveries with a feeling in her chest that she had not felt since she was a girl reading novels by the fire. She wrote back about teaching school, though she framed it carefully as something Vivienne had also done for a time, which was true enough. She wrote about her love of baking bread and her profound failure at it, which made him write back an entire paragraph about his own disastrous attempts to make biscuits. She wrote about Vivienne in the third person once, almost by accident, saying that she had lost someone dear to her recently and that the grief came in waves, and his response to that particular letter arrived faster than any other, 3 pages long, full of such genuine compassion that Clara had to set it down twice before she could finish reading it. She was lying to him. The knowledge of it sat in her chest like a stone she carried everywhere. But she was also more herself in these letters than she had been in years. Because she was writing as Vivienne, she felt freed from some of the careful smallness she had always practiced, the way she had always let her sister step forward while she stood slightly behind. Writing as Vivienne, she allowed herself to be bold and funny and direct in ways she normally suppressed. She told him when she thought something he said was foolish. She disagreed with his assessment of the railroad's benefit to small ranches. She admitted that she found the idea of moving to a territory she had never seen both terrifying and magnificent. He wrote back, "You are the most honest woman I have corresponded with in my entire life, which is not as long a life as some but long enough to know the difference." She pressed that letter flat and kept it in the tin box with the $31. In January, Eli Calloway made a formal proposal of marriage. He wrote it seriously, without flourish, but there was something underneath the straightforward words that was entirely not straightforward. He said he understood that moving across half a country to marry a man she had never met required a kind of courage he respected more than he could properly say. He said he hoped she would come. He said the ranch had a spare room that got good morning light, and that he had been thinking about that room lately in a way that surprised him. Clara sat with that letter for 4 days. On the 5th day she wrote back and accepted. She told herself she would tell him everything when she arrived. She told herself that the pretense was only a formality now, that the letters had been real even if the name had not, that the person he had fallen into correspondence with was genuinely her, and that once she explained it all in person, once he could see her face and hear her voice, he would understand. She told herself this the way people tell themselves things they need to believe in order to take the next step, which is to say she half believed it and half knew it was something she would have to reckon with later. She spent the rest of January getting her affairs in order. She paid Mrs. Gable everything she owed. She sold 2 dresses and a pair of boots to Mrs. Hargrove at the dry goods store. She bought a train ticket to Denver, and from there made arrangements for a stage to Cedar Hollow. She packed everything she owned into a single trunk and a carpet bag. On the morning she left, she stood at Vivienne's grave in the churchyard for a long time. The ground was frozen and the sky was the color of pewter, and she spoke to her sister quietly, explaining what she had done and why, asking for something she was not sure she deserved. Forgiveness, maybe, or just the sense that Vivienne would have understood. "You always said I thought too much and acted too little," she said to the grave. "I suppose this is me acting." The train was loud and smelled of coal, and the man across from her snored for 11 hours straight. She arrived in Denver with a headache and a conviction that she was either doing the bravest thing she had ever done or the stupidest one, and she could not yet tell which. The stage to Cedar Hollow took 2 days and covered ground so beautiful it hurt to look at. The Rocky Mountains came up on the western horizon like something from a painting and stayed there, watching, permanent as judgment. The other passengers were a traveling salesman, a woman visiting her daughter, and a quiet man with a badge who got off at a stop Clara never caught the name of. She kept her carpet bag on her lap and watched the land unfold outside the window, and thought about a man she had never met who wrote about morning light in a spare room. Cedar Hollow was smaller than she had imagined, which was saying something because she had not imagined it particularly large. A single main street with a general store, a telegraph office, a saloon, a church, a livery stable, and a scattering of other establishments that were doing their best against the weight of the winter. The stage stopped outside the general store, and Clara stepped down into mud that tried to take her boot and had to grab the wheel to steady herself, which was not the entrance she had rehearsed. She straightened her coat and looked around. He was leaning against the post outside the general store. She knew him immediately, though she had never seen him, because he was looking at the stage the way people look at things they have been waiting for long enough that looking is both relief and a kind of fear. He was tall without making a point of it, broad-shouldered in a sheepskin coat, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that were a color she could not quite determine from this distance. He had a hat pushed back on his head, and his hands were in his pockets, and he was maybe 27 or 28 years old, with a face that had been weathered by outdoor work into something that was not classically handsome but was thoroughly honest. He was looking at her. Clara walked toward him across the mud because there was nothing else to do. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was lower than she had somehow expected, though she could not have said what she expected since she had never heard it before. He pulled his hat off when she reached him, a gesture so instinctively courteous that she felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "Yes," she said, which was true and not true in the particular way her life had been true and not true for the last 4 months. His eyes were green, she could see now, a pale, steady green that reminded her of river water in summer. "Eli Calloway." He put his hand out, she shook it. His hand was warm and calloused and large, and the handshake lasted exactly the right amount of time, firm without being a performance. "You had a long journey. 2 days on the stage after the train," she confirmed. "I am very familiar with every rut between Denver and this post." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile yet. "Are you hungry?" "Extremely. Mrs. Dunbar at the hotel keeps a good table. I thought we could get a meal, and then I can take you out to the ranch when you feel settled enough. There's no rush on any of it." He said "no rush," with a kind of careful deliberateness that told her he understood this was a significant thing for her, arriving in a strange place to meet a stranger, and that he intended to make it as easy as he could. She noticed that. She filed it away alongside everything she already knew about him from 4 months of letters, which was considerable, though she was the only one who knew how considerable it was. Mrs. Dunbar's hotel dining room was warm and smelled of wood smoke and beef stew, and Clara ate with an appetite that probably embarrassed her and did not care. Eli ordered coffee and a plate of his own, and they sat across from each other at a small table by the window and talked. This was the part she had been most afraid of. She had spent the last weeks of the journey imagining this moment, the first meeting, the collision of the person she had constructed in the letters with whoever she actually was in person. She had imagined it going wrong in a dozen different ways, but it was easy. That was the thing she had not anticipated. It was inexplicably, disarmingly easy. He asked about the journey, and she told him about the snoring man on the train and the mud that had tried to eat her boot, and he laughed properly, a real laugh, and told her that Cedar Hollow's Main Street was a perpetual problem that the town council had been arguing about for 3 years without resolution. She asked about Copper, the horse he had mentioned in December's letters, and he looked at her with a quick interest in his eyes. "You remembered that," he said. "You wrote about him quite affectionately." "He's doing well, mostly gentled now." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "I'm glad you remembered." She caught something in that, a particular quality of attention, but she could not read it clearly, and so she let it pass. They talked for 2 hours. Outside, the winter afternoon settled into early dark the way it did in the mountains, sudden and complete. He drove her out to the ranch in a buckboard wagon, and she sat beside him on the bench with the cold pressing in from all sides and the stars beginning to appear above the peaks, and she thought that she had never in her life been in a place so simultaneously lonely and magnificent. The ranch was not large, but it was well kept, which told her things about him that the letters had already suggested. The house was log and stone with a porch that ran along the front and a barn that stood solid against the weather. He showed her the spare room first, with a kind of particular deliberateness, and it was exactly as he had described. It faced east. In the morning she would learn. The light came through the single window and lay across the floor in a warm stripe that moved slowly toward the wall as the day progressed. She stood in the doorway of that room and felt something she could not immediately identify, which she later understood was the sensation of arriving somewhere. "It's a good room," she said. "I thought so." She spent 3 days on the ranch before anything significant happened. She met his hired hand, a man named Pete Alderman who was 50 years old and said approximately 4 words a day and meant all of them. She met the horses, Copper among them, a roan with suspicious eyes who eventually allowed her to scratch behind his left ear. She learned the layout of the land, the creek to the north, the pasture to the south, the line of cottonwoods along the eastern fence. She baked bread on the second morning, and it came out creditably, which she took as a sign. She and Eli talked in the evenings after supper. They sat on opposite sides of the fireplace and talked the way people talk when they have already established something in writing and are now testing whether it survives the translation into presence. It did. It survived and then some, because there were things in person that letters could never carry. The precise quality of his silence when he was thinking, the way he looked at her when she said something that surprised him, the fact that he had an opinion about everything and stated it without aggression, and listened when she pushed back. On the third evening she pushed back on something he said about the territorial government, a fairly obscure point about land survey practices, and he sat forward in his chair and said, "You are exactly what I expected and not at all what I expected, and I am still working out how that is possible." Clara felt the lie shift inside her like something waking up. She went to bed that night and lay in the spare room looking at the dark ceiling and faced what she had been avoiding since she sealed the first letter. She had to tell him. She had known she had to tell him since October, but the knowing and the doing were 2 different countries, and she had been lingering at the border between them. She could not keep letting him look at her with that steady green attention and call her by her sister's name. She could not let this go further without him knowing who he had actually been writing to. She got up before dawn on the 4th day. She built the fire in the kitchen stove herself, slowly and clumsily, and put the coffee on. She was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around a mug when Eli came in from doing the early chores, bringing cold air and the smell of hay with him. He stopped when he saw her, then came and poured himself a cup and sat down at the other end of the table. "You have something to tell me," he said. Not a question. She looked up. His face was calm, watchful, careful in the way that faces are careful when they have been preparing for a thing. "I have something I should have told you immediately," she said. "Possibly before I ever came here. Certainly before I let 4 months of correspondence go by." He waited. She took a breath that required more composure than she expected. "The woman who first signed her name to the matrimonial bureau in St. Louis was my sister Vivienne, not me. My name is Clara Whitmore." She watched his face. His expression did not change, which confused her. "Vivienne died 6 weeks after she signed on, of fever. She never received your first letter." "I received it and I read it, and I should have written to tell you that there had been a mistake, that she was gone. But I read it and I answered it instead. I answered all of them. Every letter you received from Vivienne Whitmore was written by me. I'm not the woman you thought you were corresponding with. I don't know if you want me to leave or if you want to say something terrible to me, and I would understand either one. But I couldn't continue without you knowing." She stopped. The fire snapped in the stove. Outside, Copper made a sound in the barn that carried clearly through the cold air. Eli Calloway looked at her for a long moment, and then he set down his coffee cup with a deliberate gentleness and he said, "I know." Clara stared at him. "I know your name is Clara," he said. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled too tight. She could hear her own heartbeat. "What do you mean you know?" she said. It was not really a question. Her voice had gone strange. I mean, I have known for some time. He was watching her steadily, that particular quality of attention that she had noticed from the first evening. There is a woman at the matrimonial bureau in St. Louis. Her name is Mrs. Pruitt. She handles correspondence for a number of men out here who sign on to the bureau. She wrote to me in November, not long after your second letter arrived, to tell me that the young woman I had been matched with had passed away. She included a note of condolence and said she would find me another match if I wanted. November, Clara said. Yes. You never said anything. No. He turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands. I thought about it. I thought about writing and asking you directly who you were. I almost did twice. But by November we were into our second month of letters, and I had read everything you wrote very carefully, and I felt that I understood something about the person who was writing to me, whoever she was, and I decided I would rather meet her and know for certain than write a letter that might frighten her away. Clara realized her hands were shaking. She put them flat on the table. You let me come all the way out here knowing. I let you come because I wanted to meet you. The simplicity of it was staggering. Clara. He said her real name for the first time, and it sounded entirely natural in his mouth, as though he had been saying it to himself for weeks, which she suspected he had. Every word in those letters was real. Whatever name was on the outside of the envelope, the person inside them was real, and I wanted to meet her. She could not speak for a moment. She was not sure she trusted herself to. You should be angry with me, she said finally. Maybe I should be. He considered this seriously, the way she had come to recognize he considered things. I'm not. You lost your sister. You were frightened and you reached out the only way that was available to you. You were also scrupulously honest about everything except your name, which is not nothing. It is actually quite significantly something. It is. I'm not saying it wasn't. There was something in his eyes that was not quite a smile but was related to one. What I'm saying is that the woman who wrote those letters knew herself well enough to be honest about what she thought and what she believed and what frightened her. I trusted that woman. I still trust her. I just need to know if she is willing to be herself now, out loud in daylight, without the letter to hide behind. Clara looked at him across the kitchen table in the early morning light. The fire in the stove was going well now. The coffee was cooling in her mug. Outside the window, the eastern sky was beginning to lighten over the mountains in a way that she had only read about before but was now seeing for the first time with her own eyes, and it was exactly as he had described it. My name is Clara, she said. I am 22 years old. I taught school for 2 years before the school closed. I love autumn and I am a creditable bread baker as of this week. I am frightened of quite a lot of things, but I am trying to be less so. I write letters better than I speak, usually, except apparently today. She stopped. And I am sorry. I am genuinely sorry for the deception, even though you seem to be taking it with an equanimity I did not anticipate. Clara, he said, yes. I would still like to marry you if you are willing and if you would like to stay. She breathed out slowly. Yes, she said, I would like to stay. Something settled in the room, something that had been held in tension releasing. He nodded once, satisfied and quiet, and got up to refill both their coffee cups, and they sat for a while longer in the morning warmth while the light came up over the mountains the way he had always said it did, turning the peaks from gray to gold to something almost painfully beautiful. The weeks that followed were a period of revelation for Clara in ways she had not anticipated. She had imagined, during the long months of correspondence, that she had come to know Eli Calloway fairly well. And she had, in the ways that letters can know a person, which is to say the considered ways, the articulate ways, the ways a person expresses themselves when they have time to think. But living alongside someone was a different kind of knowing. She learned that he was worse at sleeping than he was at admitting, that he was often up before 4 in the morning, and that this had nothing to do with ranch demands and everything to do with a restlessness that he managed but did not cure. She learned that he was profoundly patient with animals and considerably less patient with men who did not do what they said they would, a category that seemed to encompass a meaningful portion of the people he dealt with. She learned that he could be funny with a completely straight face, that the deadpan observations he dropped into otherwise serious conversations were entirely intentional, and that he was genuinely pleased when she caught them and called him on them. She learned that the ranch had a particular problem with its eastern fence line that Eli had been managing for 2 years by means of a dispute with the neighboring landowner, a man named Gerald Ashton, who believed a survey from 1877 gave him rights over 12 acres that Eli had been working as his own. This dispute ran like a low-grade fever through the ranch's daily life, surfacing periodically in the form of Ashton's riders moving along the contested fence or a terse exchange in town. Eli handled it with the particular controlled restraint of someone who had learned that patience was its own form of force, but Clara could see it wore on him. She learned, too, that Cedar Hollow had a school that had been without a teacher since the previous fall, when Miss Orton had married a man from Denver and departed. This she learned from Mrs. Dunbar at the hotel, who mentioned it in passing over the course of a conversation about the town's needs, and who then looked at Clara with a meaningful directness that suggested the mentioning was not entirely in passing. Clara raised it with Eli one evening. "I heard the school has been empty since October." He looked up from the harness he was mending. "That's right. I taught school for 2 years in Kansas." He set the harness down. "I know, you wrote about it. I thought I might speak to whoever oversees these things about whether they needed someone." He was quiet for a moment. "It doesn't pay much. It never did. The school board is Reverend Marsh, Doc Hadley, and Gerald Ashton." He said the last name with a particular flatness. "Ah," Clara said. "Ashton will make it difficult if he can. He makes everything difficult if he can." Clara thought about this. "Well," she said, "he can try." She went and spoke to Reverend Marsh the following Thursday, and then to Doc Hadley, and by the end of the week she had been installed as the teacher at Cedar Hollow's single-room schoolhouse, with a salary that was modest and a classroom that needed considerable attention, and a group of 14 children ranging in age from 6 to 13 who were variously delighted, suspicious, and in 2 cases frankly hostile. Gerald Ashton never formally objected. Clara suspected Reverend Marsh and Doc Hadley had managed him, or that he had calculated the political cost of opposing a woman so obviously well qualified, or both. She did not care particularly. She had the school, and the school had her, and by the end of the first week she was absorbed in it the way she always had been, finding the particular satisfactions of a room full of children who did not know yet how much they were capable of. She and Eli were married in the 3rd week of February by Reverend Marsh in the little church on Cedar Hollow's Main Street. The ceremony was small. Pete Alderman attended and stood very straight in a coat that Clara suspected he had borrowed. Mrs. Dunbar came and wept with a lavish enthusiasm that bore no relation to how well she knew the bride, which Clara found touching rather than strange. Roy Benson, the neighbor Eli had mentioned in his December letter as someone who borrowed tools without returning them, came and shook Eli's hand for a long time and said something quiet that Clara could not hear, but that made Eli nod seriously. Clara wore her best dress, which was blue and had been let out at the waist to account for the good biscuits she had been eating since her arrival. She carried a small bunch of dried flowers that Pete Alderman had produced from somewhere without explanation, and presented to her that morning without ceremony. When Reverend Marsh asked if she took this man to be her husband, she said yes in a voice that was entirely steady and entirely certain, which surprised her a little because she had expected at least a tremor. That evening, Eli made dinner. This was a significant gesture because Clara had gathered that his cooking was functional at best, and indeed the meal required a certain goodwill to fully appreciate. But she ate every bite and told him it was excellent, and he looked at her with the particular expression she had been cataloging since she arrived, the one that meant he knew she was being generous and was grateful for it. They sat together on the porch afterward despite the cold, because the sky was doing something remarkable with stars, the kind of sky that Clara had not grown up with in Kansas, and had not known was available to her as a regular feature of existence. She was beginning to understand that this was one of the gifts of this particular place, that the sky out here was enormous and serious, and offered itself every night without charge. "Are you glad you came?" he asked. She considered it properly, the way he had taught her to consider things by example, without rushing to the answer that was easiest to give. "Yes," she said, "I am very glad I came. I am also aware that everything about how I came was irregular and that I am lucky you are who you are." "Who am I?" "Someone who reads letters carefully enough to know the person writing them." She paused. "Someone who let me come anyway." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, it was with the particular deliberateness he reserved for things that mattered to him. "The Mrs. Prewitt at the bureau said the young woman had a sister. She mentioned it almost in passing, just as a fact. I don't think she knew you were the one writing." He tilted his head back to look at the sky. "I thought about that a lot. Someone had lost a sister and then answered a letter that wasn't for her. I thought about what kind of person does that, and I thought it was probably someone who was very alone and very brave and maybe not fully aware that she was brave." Clara felt something in her throat that she had to wait out before she could speak. "That is a very generous reading. It is an accurate one." He turned to look at her. In the cold and the starlight his face was steady and certain. "I'm glad you wrote back." She reached over and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with an ease that suggested they had been doing this for years, which they had not, which was one of those confounding things about the right person at the right moment. Spring came to the Colorado Territory with a slowness that felt deliberate, as though the mountains were testing whether you really meant to stay. March was cold and fitful with late snows that could surprise you on a morning that had started in sunlight. April softened gradually, the creek running high with snowmelt, the pastures beginning to green up in patches that spread day by day. By May the cottonwoods had leafed out, and the mornings were warm enough to take coffee on the porch, which Clara and Eli did every morning that was not actively raining, sitting side by side on the porch bench with the light coming over the mountains and the horses moving in the pasture below. The fence dispute with Ashton came to a head in April. One of Ashton's riders, a man named Cord who had the specific air of someone who had been told he was intimidating and had come to believe it, appeared at the eastern fence line 3 mornings in a row pulling stakes and moving them. The third morning, Eli rode out and had a conversation with Cord that Clara did not witness, but that Pete Alderman told her afterward involved Eli being very quiet and very specific in a way that apparently communicated a great deal without raising his voice. Cord did not come back a 4th morning. But Ashton filed a formal complaint with the county seat, and this meant that there was now a legal process that had to be followed, a surveyor brought in from Pueblo, hearings before the county recorder, correspondence with lawyers that cost money they had to think about spending. Clara discovered that she had opinions about this. She had opinions about legal documents, and she had opinions about Ashton, and she had opinions about the particular injustice of a man with more money using that money to apply pressure to people with less, which was a pattern she recognized from having watched it her entire life in one form or another. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings while Eli went through the papers, and she read everything he read and they talked through it together, which he had not expected her to want to do, and which she could see surprised and pleased him. "This survey from 1877 is the problem," she said one evening, reading it for the 3rd time. "But look at this. The benchmark marker they used was described as a particular rock formation on the creek bend. Has that formation changed in 5 years?" He looked up. "The creek shifted after the flood of 1878. I remember because it took out part of our north fence. Then the benchmark may not be where Ashton's survey places it." He was very still for a moment. Then he leaned across the table and looked at where she was pointing, and something changed in his expression, a sharpening, a quickening. "Clara, I am not a lawyer," she said, "but I think you need to write to your lawyer and ask him this question." He wrote the letter that night. The response, when it came, confirmed enough to give them a strong argument. And when the county surveyor came out in May and stood at the creek bend with his equipment and his notes, the new measurements told a story that significantly complicated Ashton's claim. The case was not resolved overnight, these things rarely were, but the legal footing shifted in a meaningful way, and Ashton's correspondence became less aggressive and more carefully worded, which was a satisfying development. Eli looked at Clara across the kitchen table the evening after the surveyor left and said, "I would have missed that entirely. You were too close to it. Possibly. Also less inclined to read legal surveys for pleasure." "I did not read it for pleasure. I read it because it was there and it concerned us." "Us," he said. He said it the way he sometimes repeated words that mattered to him, not highlighting them exactly but noting them, the way you note something you intend to hold on to. The summer was long and full in the way that working summers are, days that began before the sun and ended after it, filled with the particular rhythm of ranch life that Clara was learning with the careful attention she had always brought to new knowledge. She could not do everything Pete Alderman did, nor did she try, but she could do considerably more than she could in February, and she took a particular satisfaction in charting that progress. She could handle copper without fuss now. She could read the weather in the way the morning clouds sat against the peaks. She knew which section of the north pasture got waterlogged after rain and adjusted accordingly. The school let out in June and took up again in September, which gave her the summer to focus on the ranch, and this suited her. She also, in July, undertook a project that had nothing to do with either the ranch or the school, which was to write to the county about establishing a small lending library in Cedar Hollow. This involved a quantity of letters to various officials and organizations, and eventually to a charitable institution in Denver that provided books to frontier communities. Pete Alderman watched this campaign unfold from a careful distance and said, on one notable occasion, 5 words, which was a personal record, "Reckon they will say yes." They said yes in August. The books arrived in September on the stage, and Clara organized them in a corner of the schoolroom that she had designated for the purpose. And on the first Saturday after the school term started, she opened the schoolroom to the town and let anyone who wanted borrow a book with their name written in a ledger that she kept on the front table. The turnout was larger than she had expected. Eli came and stood in the back of the room watching with an expression she had learned to read by now, which was his way of being proud of her without making a production of it. Roy Benson borrowed a novel about sea voyages, which was perhaps not the most practical reading for a man in landlocked Colorado, but he held it like something valuable and carried it out carefully, and returned it 2 weeks later in perfect condition, which Clara considered a victory. The fall was the season Clara had written about in her letters, the most truthful season because it did not pretend that things did not end. In the Colorado Territory, autumn arrived with a specificity of color she had not encountered before, the aspens going gold against the dark green of the pines and the deep blue of the high sky, everything luminous and exact in the particular mountain light. She had grown up with the gentler autumns of the Kansas prairie, which were beautiful in their own way, but this was something else, something that felt like an argument for paying attention. She told Eli one evening in October, sitting on the porch in the last of the afternoon warmth, that she had been thinking about Vivienne. "Tell me about her," he said. She had talked about her sister before in pieces, but not in any complete or deliberate way, and she recognized the offer for what it was. She talked for a long time. She told him about Vivienne's quick laughter and the way she had been bold where Clara was careful, impulsive where Clara was deliberate. She told him about the boarding house and the fever and the 6 weeks of grief that had led to a letter opened in a post office doorway. She told him that she thought about Vivienne every day and that the thinking was not always sad anymore, that it had become something else, something more like a presence than an absence. "She would have liked you," she said. She had a weakness for honest men. What did you have a weakness for? Clara considered this seriously. I thought I had a weakness for safety, for staying still. She looked out at the pasture, the golden light lying across the dry autumn grass. Apparently I was wrong. He reached over and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with the kind of gentleness that was so natural to him by now that she sometimes forgot to notice it, and then noticed it suddenly and was completely undone. You were never as still as you thought, he said. She discovered in October that she was expecting a child. She sat with this knowledge for 3 days, rolling it around in her mind from different angles the way she had once rolled the decision to answer Eli's first letter, testing it for fear and finding, unexpectedly, that the fear was manageable, was in fact considerably smaller than the other thing she found, which was a joy so large she was not quite sure what to do with it. She told him on a Thursday morning over coffee. He went very still. Then he set down his cup with great care and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on him before, which was not surprising because she had never shown him anything like this before. It was open in a way his face was not usually open, everything he was thinking available on the surface all at once, and what was there was so pure and clear that she had to look at the table for a moment to bear it. Clara, he said, just that, her name in his voice with everything in it. Sometime in the spring, she said. May, I think. Doc Hadley will know better. He got up and came around the table, and she stood, and he held her for a long time in the kitchen, with the fire going in the stove, and the light coming through the east window in that particular morning stripe across the floor, and she pressed her face into his sheepskin coat and breathed. Are you frightened? He asked against her hair. A little, she said. Are you? A great deal, he said. Also extremely happy. Yes, she said. That is exactly what it is. The pregnancy progressed through the winter with a steadiness that Doc Hadley called encouraging and that Clara experienced as an education in the limits of her control over her own body, which she found alternately humbling and fascinating. She was tired in ways she had not anticipated, and sick in ways that were creative and inconvenient. And she had a craving for pickled beets that she found philosophically interesting, though she had never previously had any particular feeling about pickled beets. She also found herself in the evenings more inclined to sit still than she had been, which Eli accommodated by reading aloud to her from whatever book happened to be on hand, which ranged from the territorial newspaper to a novel about a sea voyage that Roy Benson had recommended with unexpected passion. The school continued through November and then was out for the winter, and Clara found herself in the particular position of a woman with an active mind, confined to shorter physical range. She turned this toward the library correspondence and toward a project she had been thinking about for some time, which was to write down everything she knew about the region's educational needs and submit it to the Territorial Education Office in Denver. She did not know if this would accomplish anything. She wrote it anyway, carefully and specifically, drawing on everything she had seen in her months of teaching in Cedar Hollow, and she sent it with a cover letter that was direct without being strident. She received a response in January from a woman named Miss Adele Cartwright, who was an inspector for the Territorial Board, and who wrote back with a briskness that Clara found immediately appealing. Miss Cartwright said that she had read the submission with interest and that she would be making a tour of territory schools in the spring, and intended to include Cedar Hollow on her schedule. Clara told Eli over dinner, and he looked amused and proud in equal measure. You've been here less than a year, he said. Is that too soon to have opinions? Not for you. The fence dispute with Ashton resolved itself in January, which Clara considered a satisfying piece of timing, as though the new year had been clearing its throat and settling accounts. The county recorder ruled in Eli's favor on the basis of the adjusted survey measurements, which upheld his claim to the 12 acres in question. Ashton did not take it gracefully, which no one had expected him to, but he took it legally, which was what mattered. Eli rode out to the eastern fence line the day after the ruling and stood there for a while, and when he came back he was quiet in a way that was not unhappy but simply complete, the way people are when something they have been carrying puts itself down. "How does it feel?" Clara asked. "Like I can think about something else now," he said. Roy Benson came over that evening with a bottle of whiskey that he had been apparently saving for a significant occasion, and Pete Alderman accepted a small glass and drank it with the gravity of a man participating in a sacrament. And Clara drank a very small amount of hers, and was content with the warmth and the company, and the particular rightness of being in a room with people who meant her well. Spring came more quickly than Clara expected, which was perhaps because winter had been full enough that she had not spent it watching the window for signs. By March she was very large and moving with the careful deliberateness of someone navigating a new relationship with her own body, and the mountain light was beginning to shift toward the longer days, and the aspens at the creek bend were showing the first green of their new leaves. The baby was born in the middle of a May morning that was as blue and clear as anything Clara had ever seen. Doc Hadley was there, and Mrs. Dunbar, who had appointed herself the unofficial support of every woman in Cedar Hollow giving birth, which meant she had attended probably 30 deliveries and had opinions about all of them that she shared freely, and which Clara found oddly reassuring in their authority. It was a boy, 7 pounds, solid and urgent in the way of all new people, dark-haired like his father with eyes that were the peculiar indeterminate color of every new baby's eyes, and that would take their time settling into whatever color they were going to be. Eli came in when it was done and sat on the edge of the bed, and held his son with the particular care of someone holding something irreplaceable. And Clara watched him and thought about October letters and frozen churchyard mornings, and the mud that had tried to eat her boot, and about how the path between those things and this moment was irregular and crooked, and had no business arriving somewhere this good, and yet here they were. "What shall we name him?" Eli asked. His voice was different than usual, quieter, closer. She had thought about this. "I would like to call him James," she said, "for your father." She had learned about his father in the letters and then in person, a man who had worked the same land and died too young and left Eli the ranch and a stubborn belief in the worth of the work. "If you agree." He looked at her over the baby's head, and there was that open expression again, the one that undid her. "James," he said. "Yes." She reached up and touched his face briefly, a small specific gesture, and he turned and kissed her hand with a formality that was also entirely tender, the way he sometimes expressed things that were too large for casual handling. The summer that James was born was full in the way all summers were but fuller, because there was now a baby at the center of it who required attention at hours that were creative and relentless, and who rewarded that attention with a growing catalog of expressions and sounds. And then, in August, a first definitive smile that made Pete Alderman stop in the middle of the yard and say, with feeling, "Well." Miss Adele Cartwright of the Territorial Education Board arrived in Cedar Hollow in September as promised. She was a woman of 40-something with a precise manner and a sharp eye, and a total absence of any impulse to soften her assessments, which Clara found entirely refreshing. She inspected the school with a thoroughness that included examining the borrowed library books for condition, and asking the children questions that they answered with varying degrees of success. And she spoke with Clara for 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon in the schoolroom with James asleep in a basket at Clara's feet. At the end of the conversation, Miss Cartwright said, "Your submission to the board was one of 3 I have received this year that demonstrated a real understanding of the territorial context. The other 2 were from men with formal teaching certificates. Yours was from a woman with 2 years of experience who has been in this territory for less than a year." "I have been paying attention," Clara said. Evidently, Miss Cartwright looked at her with an assessment that was not unkind. "I am going to recommend to the board that Cedar Hollow receive additional funding for school supplies and that your salary be reviewed. I am also going to note the library initiative in my report. It is the kind of thing the board should know is possible in a community of this size." Clara thanked her. After she left, Clara sat for a while in the empty schoolroom with James awake now in his basket and looking at the ceiling with the thoughtful expression babies have when they are processing the universe, and she felt the particular satisfaction of work seen and valued, which was different from praise and more nourishing. She told Eli that evening, and he sat quietly for a moment and then said, "I'm going to need a bigger fence to keep up with you." "You have a perfectly adequate fence," she said. "The county confirmed it." He laughed, properly and fully, and James startled at the sound, and then made a noise that was not quite a laugh but was its near relation, and Clara felt the moment settle around her like something that intended to last. The years had a way of accumulating in the Colorado territory that Clara found both faster and more specific than she had expected. Seasons stacked on each other with a narrative logic, each one teaching something the previous one had left out. By the time James was walking with the confident unsteadiness of a toddler exploring a world that was exactly as interesting as he suspected, Clara had been in Cedar Hollow for 2 years and could no longer clearly remember the boarding house in Kansas as a place that had contained her whole life. It seemed instead like the place she had been before her life began, which she knew was not quite fair to the woman she had been there, but was true in some important way nonetheless. The school grew. By the fall of 1884, she had 19 students and had successfully argued the school board, now without Ashton, who had sold his ranch and moved on, for a new set of readers and a proper globe. Roy Benson's youngest 2 children were among her students, and Roy himself had taken to borrowing 2 books at a time from the library, which Clara tracked in the ledger with the same care she gave everything else. Pete Alderman broke his arm in the spring of that second year, falling from a ladder with the resigned air of a man who had suspected this would happen eventually. And while he healed, Clara took over a significant portion of his work, with a matter-of-factness that he observed from the porch, with what she had learned to identify as his version of deep appreciation. He was back to full capacity by summer, but thereafter he seemed to regard Clara with a slight added gravity, as though she had been confirmed in some test he had been quietly administering since she arrived. Eli expanded the herd in the summer of 1884, a calculated risk that required borrowing money from the bank in Pueblo, which they discussed for 2 weeks from every angle before deciding. The cattle market was strong and the eastern fence land was fully in their control now, with the good pasture it contained, and the decision was sound. It was still a risk. The way all things worth doing had some risk in them, and they lived with that awareness through the first year of the expansion with a careful attention to every piece of information the ranch provided. By the fall of 1884, it was clear the decision had been right. Not extravagantly right, not the kind of thing that immediately changed everything, but solidly and quietly right in the way that good, careful work tends to confirm itself. Clara discovered she was expecting again in October of 1884, which James greeted, upon being approximately informed of the concept in terms a 2-year-old could engage with an interest in whether the new person would be able to run yet. She assured him that it would take some time. She wrote to Miss Cartwright to inform her, because they had developed a correspondence over the past year that had grown into something Clara valued, the particular friendship of 2 women who found each other's minds interesting, and who had decided that geography was not a sufficient obstacle. Miss Cartwright wrote back with congratulations, and also with a note that she had recommended Clara's name to a committee in Denver that was working on developing a standardized curriculum guide for territorial schools, and that if Clara had interest and time, they would welcome her contribution. Clara wrote back that she had interest and would make the time. The second baby arrived in June of 1885, another solid and urgent new person, this one a girl who arrived at dawn with the light coming up exactly as it always did over the mountains, turning from gray to gold. They named her Vivienne. Eli said the name aloud quietly when he first held her, testing it, recognizing it. He looked at Clara and she met his eyes, and no words were needed for what passed between them. It was not a sad naming. It was a honoring, the kind of naming that was full rather than empty, that said the person was remembered and that something of them continued. James visited his sister with the careful proprietary interest of a 2-year-old who had adjusted his understanding of the universe to accommodate her existence. He looked at her for a long time and said, "Small," with a gravity that made Eli cover his mouth and look at the ceiling. The summer of 1885 was warm and busy, and full in the way Clara had come to understand as the characteristic quality of a life well lived, which was not absence of difficulty but presence of meaning. Vivienne grew with a speed that seemed to defy the ordinary rules of time. James learned to ride, or began learning, with a determined recklessness that aged both his parents slightly. The school board approved the new readers. Miss Cartwright visited twice, once officially and once simply as a guest, and on the second visit she and Clara sat on the porch one evening while the children slept inside and Eli sat at the far end of the porch doing something to a piece of harness. And they talked for hours about education, and the territory, and the particular challenges facing women who wanted to do useful work in a world that was still deciding how useful they were allowed to be. "You could do more than this school," Miss Cartwright said. She was not critical of the school. She meant it as an observation about possibility. "I could," Clara agreed. "But this school needs doing, and it is also where I am." Those two things don't always have to be the same, Clara thought about this. "They have to be the same for me right now," she said. "That is not a complaint, it is a description." She looked out at the dark pasture where the horses moved quietly. "I used to think my life was going to be a series of safe choices, that I would stay still and manage. I wrote a letter instead." She paused. "Everything I have came from writing that letter." Eli at the far end of the porch did not look up from the harness. But she saw the slight still of his hands, and she knew he had heard. "He is a good man," Miss Cartwright said. "He is the best man I know," Clara said. "And he let me come here knowing I had lied to him, because he read the letters carefully enough to know the person writing them." She shook her head slowly at the continued improbability of it. "I think about that often." In the fall of 1885, Clara submitted her contribution to the Denver Committee's curriculum project. 40 pages of carefully organized observations and recommendations drawn from her teaching experience and her reading and her correspondence with Miss Cartwright. She sent it without knowing what would come of it and went back to teaching her 19 students and did not think about it over much because the alternative was thinking about it constantly, and that seemed counterproductive. She received a reply in November. Her contribution had been incorporated substantially into the draft guide, and her name would appear among the acknowledged contributors. This was not a large public recognition. It was, in the territory in 1885, more than she had expected. She showed Eli the letter. He read it carefully, all the way to the bottom, and then looked up with an expression she knew very well by now, the one that was pride restrained to just the right degree. "Acknowledged contributor," he said. "It sounds more formal than it is." "It sounds exactly like what it is." He set the letter on the table between them. "You wrote a letter to a stranger 4 years ago because you were afraid and alone and brave enough to reach anyway. Now your name is on a curriculum guide for the Colorado Territory." He raised an eyebrow. "Seems consistent, actually." "I was not brave," she said. "I was desperate." "Those are not mutually exclusive." She laughed. He smiled, and they were sitting at the same kitchen table where she had confessed everything on a cold, dark morning 4 years ago, and the fire was going in the same stove, and the coffee was cooling in their cups in the same way, and the light would come through the same east window in the morning. "Eli," she said. "Yes." "Thank you." She said it plainly, without decoration. "For letting me come, for reading the letters the way you did, for saying my name." He looked at her steadily across the table. "Clara," he said, the same way he had always said it, with everything in it, "there is nowhere else you were ever supposed to be." It was not the most elaborate declaration. It was entirely typical of him, which was to say it was specific and honest and meant precisely what it said without excess. and she would not have had it any other way. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and the fire in the stove snapped quietly, and from the room down the hall came the soft breathing sounds of two children sleeping, James and Vivienne, 4 years old and barely 5 months, both entirely unaware that they existed at the intersection of a deception and a grace, a letter written under a dead woman's name, and a man patient enough to wait for the truth to find its own way home. Outside, the Colorado stars were doing their usual extraordinary work. The mountains were dark against the darker sky. The horses were still in the pasture, Copper among them, the roan that Eli had gentled in the fall before Clara arrived, and that had eventually decided she was acceptable, which was about as much as Copper gave anyone, and which she considered a proper compliment. Everything that had been uncertain had come to be certain. Everything that had been hidden had come to be known. The 12 acres of eastern pasture were theirs, and had been theirs for 2 years without dispute. The school had 19 students and a real globe and a lending library that Roy Benson used every 2 weeks with the dedication of a convert. Pete Alderman's arm had healed straight, and he was in the barn right now, probably doing something useful and saying nothing about it. Mrs. Dunbar at the hotel would ask after the children whenever Clara came into town, and Reverend Marsh had baptized both of them with a warm ceremony, and Miss Cartwright wrote every 6 weeks from Denver with news of the committee and occasional book recommendations. And Eli Calloway, who had read her letters with a patience and attention that had seen through the name on the outside to the person inside, who had chosen to let her come anyway, who had said her real name for the first time over a kitchen table in the early morning, and made it sound like something that had always belonged there, was sitting across from her now, holding her hand in the firelight of a house that was theirs, in a life that was theirs, in a place that was home. Clara Whitmore, who had become Clara Calloway, who had pretended to be her sister in the letters and had been told by the cowboy that he had already known, looked at her husband across their kitchen table and thought that the most truthful season was autumn, and autumn was right, because it did not pretend that things did not end, but it also did not pretend that what was beautiful was not beautiful, and what was real was not real, and what was found was not found. She had been found. She had also done the finding. She suspected those two things were, in the end, the same. James said something from down the hall, a sleep murmur, unintelligible in content. Vivienne was quiet, dreaming whatever it was that nearly 5-month-olds dreamed of, which Clara liked to think was simply the sensation of being warm and known. "Are you tired?" Eli asked. "Not yet. Do you want more coffee?" "Yes." He got up to get it, and she watched him in the firelight, this man she had come to know letter by letter and then day by day, who was solid and honest and funny in a way that crept up on you, who read legal surveys when she asked him to, and held newborns like they were the most important thing he had ever been entrusted with, and who had said, when she confessed everything, "I know," with the quiet calm of someone who had already decided that the truth he had found was enough, was more than enough, was exactly right. He set the coffee cup in front of her and sat back down and wrapped both his hands around his own cup, and they were quiet together in the easy way of people who have earned their quiet, and the fire burned, and the stars turned overhead, and Cedar Hollow, Colorado, in the year 1885, kept its peace around them, solid and permanent as the mountains watching from the west. Clara took a sip of her coffee. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods at the creek bend, a sound she had come to love in the way you love the things that have become the sound of your life. She thought of the post office doorway in Redemption Creek, Kansas, the envelope in her hand smelling of rose water, the name that was not hers on the outside. She thought of the blank paper and the ink in the moment before the first word, the terrible and necessary leap. She had taken the leap. He had been waiting at the other side, patient and observant, and already reading her clearly before she had even arrived. "Eli," she said, "I would write those letters again." She looked at him. "Every one of them. Knowing everything I know now, I would write them all exactly the same." He looked at her for a long moment. The fire had settled to a steady burn, comfortable and reliable. "I would write mine the same too," he said. "All of them, including the ones where I almost asked you who you really were and decided to wait." Why did you wait? He thought about it as he thought about things without rushing. "Because the person writing to me was already telling me who she was," he said. "Every letter. The name didn't matter as much as what was in them." He tilted his head slightly. "And because I thought she deserved the chance to tell me herself." Clara felt that the way you feel something that has been true for a long time, and that you suddenly find the exact right words for. She felt it settle into place alongside everything else that had settled into place over the past years. The house and the pasture and the children and the work, all of it coherent and entire, all of it hers. "She did," Clara said. "And she did." He smiled at her, the full smile that she had first seen in the hotel dining room in Cedar Hollow on a February afternoon when she was a woman who had spent 4 months being brave in the dark. The smile that she had since seen 1,000 times in 1,000 variations of the light that came through the mountains of the Colorado Territory, morning light and evening light and the brilliant clear light of summer and the cold gold light of autumn, all of it different and all of it showing her the same face, this face, steady and honest in hers. "More coffee," he said. "Please," she said. He poured it, and the evening held, and everything was as it was, and as it would continue to be, resolved and complete and full. The story of the letter and the name and the waiting all come to its proper end here in this kitchen, in this warmth, with these two people who had found each other through the unlikely grace of words written honestly enough to travel across the country and land true.